What happens when a man who has everything, wealth, success, power, walks into his own home early, only to discover that the one thing he thought money could never buy, was missing all along? David Harrington was the kind of man people read about in glossy magazines, the man whose face was plastered on the covers of Fortune and Forbes, the man who built an empire from scratch and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar company with branches across the country. Yet despite the marble floors and chandeliers of his mansion, despite the sleek cars and the staff that bowed as he passed, David lived in a world that felt strangely empty, a life dictated by board meetings, contracts, and endless flights, until one Thursday evening, fate decided to shatter the carefully polished glass walls he had built around himself. He had just returned from a meeting earlier than expected, something he never did, because his schedule was always booked down to the minute, but a storm had grounded his plane and instead of staying at the hotel like usual, he told his driver to take him straight home. As the car rolled through the iron gates, David noticed the windows of his mansion glowing warmly, laughter faintly drifting into the night air. A sound he hadn't heard in his home for a long time, and with his suitcase still in hand, he quietly stepped inside, only to stop dead in his tracks at what he saw before him. His massive dining hall, usually so cold and empty, was alive with children he didn't recognize, barefoot kids sitting around his mahogany table, eating from platters of food his chefs had surely prepared, their little faces smeared with chocolate and bread, their laughter echoing against the marble walls. In the center of it all stood his wife, Clara, her face lit with a joy he hadn't seen in years, serving plates, pouring milk, and bending down to wipe the crumbs from a child's chin as though she were the mother of them all, and David stood frozen, suitcase slipping from his grip, his chest tightening with questions he couldn't even form. Who were these children? Why were they in his home? And why did his wife look so alive, so radiant, as if this chaos, this gathering, was the life she had been waiting for all along? He didn't announce himself right away. Instead, David lingered in the shadow of the doorway, his heart thumping with a confusion he couldn't name, his polished shoes suddenly feeling too heavy for the carpet beneath them, as he watched Clara moving gracefully between the children, ruffling a boy's hair, wiping a girl's tears when she spilled her juice, smiling with a softness David couldn't remember receiving in years. The children were clearly not from wealth. They wore faded clothes, some too big, some too small, their shoes mismatched or missing, yet there was a glow about them as they laughed, a glow that made his grand chandeliers seem dull in comparison, and it was only when one of the boys, spotting him, shouted, "There's a man at the door," that Clara turned, her face freezing in shock as her eyes landed on her husband. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the clatter of cutlery against plates, before Clara hurried toward him, her expression torn between guilt and determination, and she whispered quickly, "David, you weren't supposed to be home yet," her voice trembling but her stance firm, as though bracing herself for a storm. He demanded answers in a low growl. "Who are these children? What are they doing here? Clara, what is happening?" But before she could speak, one of the little girls tugged at Clara's dress and asked if she could have more bread, and Clara, without hesitation, turned to serve her, as if nothing in the world mattered more than that small request. Finally, when the children were content, Clara took David aside into the study, her hands clasped tightly as she confessed that every Thursday, for the last 6 months, she had been opening their home to children from the nearby orphanage, children who had no one to care for them, no warm meals, no safe space to laugh and play, and she explained that their fortune could feed thousands, yet she couldn't ignore the empty chairs in their dining hall, chairs that had remained vacant for years since they had never been blessed with children of their own, and so she had filled them, not with wealth, not with grandeur, but with the laughter of those who needed it most. David, stunned, felt anger rise at first. How dare she invite strangers into their home, risk their privacy, tarnish the image he had worked so hard to polish? But beneath the anger, something else stirred, something uncomfortable yet undeniable, a realization that maybe Clara had found a truth he had long forgotten, that a house without love is nothing more than walls, no matter how golden the paint. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the images of those children, the way they devoured the food like it was the first real meal they'd ever had, the way they laughed so freely in a house he had only ever filled with silence, the way Clara glowed with a light he couldn't remember ever bringing to her face. In his mind, he wrestled with questions of pride, control, and the cold empire he had built. What good was his wealth if it couldn't give him the joy those children seemed to find in the simplest piece of bread? The next morning, instead of heading straight to the office, David did something uncharacteristic. He drove himself to the orphanage Clara had spoken of, a weathered brick building on the poorer side of town, its paint peeling, its playground rusted, yet inside, the halls echoed with tiny voices and innocent dreams. He met the caretaker, an elderly woman named Sister Margaret, who recognized him instantly but was too polite to mention his wealth, and she told him stories of the children, how some had lost parents to illness, some to addiction, some had been abandoned on doorsteps, and how Clara had been visiting quietly, week after week, bringing food, books, and love without asking for anything in return. David walked through the halls, meeting the children, seeing their thin blankets, their broken toys, their eyes that carried burdens no child should ever know, and something inside him cracked, an ache, deep and raw, that made him question not just his marriage, but his very soul. When he returned home that evening, Clara was waiting, her eyes cautious, bracing for his verdict, but instead of anger, David sat beside her and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" And for the first time in years, tears welled in Clara's eyes as she confessed she thought he wouldn't understand, that his world was numbers and deals, not laughter and love, and David, holding her hand, realized with a jolt of clarity that the wealth he had spent decades chasing was nothing compared to the wealth Clara had quietly created with her heart. From that day forward, the Harrington mansion was never the same. The long dining table, once a monument to loneliness, became a haven for children every Thursday evening, and this time David was there too, rolling up his sleeves, serving food, listening to stories about lost pets, broken bicycles, and schoolyard dreams, laughing harder than he had in years. Word spread, and soon David used his influence not to sign another business deal, but to launch a foundation for children in need, building new facilities for orphanages, funding scholarships, and creating spaces where children could feel seen, heard, and loved. And though the world applauded him as a philanthropist, what mattered most to David wasn't the recognition, but the way Clara smiled at him again, with pride, with love, with that same glow she had the night he first saw her surrounded by children in their home. One evening, months later, as he tucked in a little boy who had fallen asleep on the couch after dinner, David whispered softly, "You've given me more than I could ever give you," and in that moment, he realized he had finally found what he never knew was missing, not heirs to his empire, but a family of the heart, built not on blood or fortune, but on kindness. And so the millionaire who once measured his worth in dollars and deals now measured it in laughter and love, all because he came home early one Thursday night, and couldn't believe what he saw. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't counted in dollars, it's counted in the smiles we create and the lives we touch. If this story moved your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Vibes. Together, let's spread more love, more hope, and more kindness into the world.